Shangshung was first the name of the Western Tibet, which was some sort of independent land. The center of this land was the mountain now called Kailash, and it used to be called Tise. The real Tibetan name for this is Tise. And Kailash of the mountain name, and also Brahmaputra, all these later early 20th century Indians giving to Tibetan places. So as a Tibetan, I always find it rather unpleasant, in fact, to see why these names are given to the Tibetan places rather than use the Tibetan names, because we are dealing with the Tibetan places and the Tibetan names. Anyway, Shangshung was an independent country, and this was invaded by the Tibetans from central Tibet, which is now the, for example, Zhang and the Yuzhang, this area, the central Tibet. Now it is the autonomous region of Tibet. And this now we can date in this, the invasion of Tibet goes back to the 7th century by the king Shonzi Gampo. And this is a historical event. It is recorded in the Dunhuang annuals, and therefore it is not just fiction. I mean, it is historical. And now the question of why the Shangshung is so important in culture, Tibetan culture, and particularly Bon culture, is another question. As Buddhism has spread from India to Tibet, Tibetan culture became Indianized to some extent, using a lot of Indian ideas, Indian concepts and so on. And so that shows the origin of Buddhism of Tibet, going back to India and so on. So before this Buddhism established in Tibet, there was a religion, or there was a faith, and this was the Bon. And the Bon was, shall we say, extremely important, some kind of a native belief. And so, from this context and from this perspective, Shangshung became extremely important for the Bon religious tradition, to show that the Bon has another origin, not Indian, but from another place, going back to this Shangshung place. This is now around the mountain Kailash, and in opposition to Buddhism, tracing back their religion back to Buddhism, to India. So, and there is also a question of the Shangshung language, which we don't know much, but now Tibet scholars begin to study properly of the Shangshung language. And in this, Professor Namkhai Norbu has played an important role in opening up the study of Shangshung, its language, its culture, and particularly he developed this theme in Tise, which is the book that he published. And this is the later Donatella Rossi translated into English, so this is now accessible to non-Tibetans. And also his studies of this Shangshung is extremely important, very highly respected by the Tibetans in Tibet itself, much more than in India itself. And thanks to his taking up the Bon studies, Tibetan Buddhists began to wonder whether they should also imitate Professor Namkhai Norbu's approach which is very important because Professor Namkhai Norbu has somehow opened up the road for the non-sectarian ideas, non-sectarian development, and non-sectarian approach and so on. This was something that existed in Tibet but never took really form properly. But Professor Namkhai Norbu has taken up that theme, and it has become extremely important for the Tibetans in India and for the Tibetans in Tibet itself.
This book, of course, is a really very important book in recent research on the Zhang Zhung and Tibet. And I think there are two reasons I can say. One is because the Zhang Zhung and Kailash area was the really very important center for the ancient civilization. That's in Tibet, lots of documents come from Buddhist historians. So they study and they are describing only the history after the introduction of the Buddhism. Before that, we can't see lots of records from the Buddhist or the books of the Buddhist historians. So this book really has a really very good research on that. Secondly, also in Tibet, Bon and Buddhism are two traditions in Tibet for already 1,300 years. But because of conflict between Bon and Buddhism in Tibet, among Tibetan, there is a problem between this kind of religion, and many people, especially some really sectarian people, they have a problem of how can I say between the problem between the people who believe in Buddhism and Bombo. But this book, when after coming out this book in Tibet, many people reading this book. And because he is a very important scholar, he is also a Buddhist scholar. So in Tibet, especially new generation, they believe very much in his study. And how can I say, for the young people, these were more and more accepting that Bon tradition and Zhang Zhung is very important for Tibet. Also, less, how can I say, sectarian people. Many people, they think that Bombo tradition and Zhang Zhung tradition is more important for Tibetan culture. That's why for these two reasons, I think it is a really great achievement in Tibetan studies. I think the Chonlong centralized really this is the area of Kailash, we say, also included Chonlong. This is was a center of Himalayan civilization in very ancient time, I think. From that area originated the Bon religion, and in Tibetan tradition we say Sipajiji Bon. This is originated from this place, and this is was center for ancient civilization of Himalayan area, and from that place spread the culture to south and east and north. So even some traditions from that place they went to India. For example, Jainism and Shivaism, this kind of very old tradition in India also, their origin can be traced to Kailash. That means there's a connection very clearly for us. That's for this reason, from that place to east and even to west, this the kind of central of the very ancient culture, and then spread from that one everywhere. So that's why Kalish area is very important for Tibetan culture.
We are beginning to see a lot more evidence and ways in which that evidence makes useful and interesting patterns, and that's given us a possibility of really doing what Namkhai Norbu Rinpoche wanted to do, I think, and still wants to do, which is to see Tibetan culture as something that really has its own integrity and history and identity, which is quite separate from what came in from India. And obviously what came in from India was massively important and influential, and so were the connections with slightly lesser scale with China and perhaps with Central Asia. But the Tibetans have their own history. It went back a long time before the arrival of Buddhism, and we're beginning now to get a bit of a sense of what it is.
Yeah, it seems to me a great pity that a lot of the archaeological activity that's been carried out in that part of the world has focused on a much later period, that is to say the period of the 10th and the 11th century. Of course, the area, as you know, is important for at least two main reasons. On the one hand, you have the Zhang Zhung tradition, and on the other hand, this is the place where the second diffusion of Buddhism began, with the translator Rinchen Zangpo and the kings of Western Tibet. And a lot of the emphasis that has been given to research in that area has tended to look rather at the second phase of diffusion of Buddhism in this area. And I think this earlier phase has been largely neglected. I'm thinking particularly of some of these sites in the Sutlej Valley, for example. It was clearly a cave civilization, similar to the kind of thing that you find in Mustang. And we know from Mustang that these caves were extremely ancient, going back to possibly the 2nd millennium BC. Highly likely that this was all part of the same broad civilization. And they were used later on for Buddhist purposes. So would you see there being some kind of continuity in the traditions between Mustang, which was referred to as Shangzhung Me, Lower Shangzhung? Would you regard this as being part of a similar culture that long predates Buddhism? Mustang and in
this Kuge and this area.
Exactly. Yeah.
I think there is not much doubt for us at least. So there is certainly relation in many cases. For example, spiritual relationship and also the people's way of life. So nowadays we can clearly see if you visit one of the caves in the Mustang, and also if you visit in the caves in the Chunglung and this Sutlej rivers, the area of caves, just exactly like similar structure, similar, and even the way of rock carving sometimes we can find. They are very close. So according to the Burn tradition, I think we in our text mentioned early time, these Shangshung people, mostly they lived in Ba. Ba means like tent, the actual tent. And also they could, there is some text describe people living in the caves. So
these were not hermits, these were actually people who were living in the caves.
No, this can be changed, as Mark last night. I think there's people change time, like winter time and summer time. Not always necessarily to stay all the time. They change.
This was certainly the case in Mustang, where they actually moved around quite a lot and used the caves for part of the time, as indeed they still do.
Then I think one of the important things is that obviously there is a lot of kind of highlights of the Kuge, the kingdom, which was around 10th century, very strongly flourished, influenced by the Buddhist. But all this system of this building and ruins, everything is not necessarily exactly that time built. There can be continuation. This could be, Kuge kingdom could be built up on the remaining of the early Shangshung kings and cities.
Which is what makes archaeological investigation all the more important, of course, to try and find out what's in the lower layers.
Yes.
Yes, until now there have been some wonderful descriptions, as we know from our colleague John Biletzer, for instance, who's been through much of Western Tibet and described mainly the surface finds.
Yeah.
But of course, with that antiquity of civilization, it's clearly necessary to go much further down, and this requires some serious long-term archaeology.
Mm-hmm.
The other thing that is clearly necessary from an archaeological point of view is that this will probably shed light on the kind of ritual activities that were performed in these areas. It seems to me that the more and more research that is done there, the more the Bonpo accounts about the importance of Pön in this area are vindicated. I'm thinking particularly about certain doubts that people had that there was any Pön at all in Zhang Zhung, because all the accounts that we have place Pön in Zhang Zhung at a much later time. These texts are all from the post-11th century period. And the texts that we have found in Dunhuang and also in the stupa that Samten Karmay was talking about, these all refer to Pön in central Tibet, not in western Tibet. But then just recently, this biography of Lalama Yeshe came out, in which there is a set of edicts in which he explicitly condemns the practice of Pön traditions and the tsuklak, the sciences of Zhang Zhung. So the more evidence we get, the more it seems to vindicate what the Bonpos have already been saying for a long time. There's been a certain amount of work done in Western Tibet in terms of archaeology, and it's already yielded some extremely promising results. One of the main areas of interest has been Khyung, which is reputed to have been the capital of the old kingdom of Zhang Zhung. There are two candidates for that. There is one so-called Silver Palace, and there is the other one that our colleague Mark Aldenderfer calls the Khyung Mesa. Now, in the Pön tradition, which of these two is actually regarded as being more important?
In Bund historical accounts, Khyung is quite often mentioned, and this is regarded as for some time the main capital, the palace of the Xiangxiong, and also this is the place where Tenpa Namkhai, who was one of the most Bonpo Siddhas early time, was born.
Okay. What do you think of some of the archaeological finds that have been made there? For example, there seem to be discoveries of palaces, maybe temples, some grave sites, and so on. Do the kinds of discoveries that you've heard about support what's been said in the Bonpo literature about Zhang Zhung and this area?
I cannot say very clearly, but I think according to the Bonpo historical accounts, there are some descriptions that Khyung and this area being as a very important place. And when in the text describes, there looks like having a very magnificent palace made out of many different kind of precious things like that. So that is what we expect is that even there is not really as exactly text described, but there should be some certain kind of the cities or the ruins of the traps of the palaces must be.
The Western Tibet is full of remarkable archaeological resources that pertain to the development of Bon, the development of Shangshung, the identification of Shangshung, the attempt to try to understand what Shangshung is really all about. The problem is, of course, that the scale of archaeological research that's been done in the Tibetan Plateau in general is very, very small, such that there's a great deal more speculation than there is empirical data. So I've had the good fortune, though, to be part of a series of projects out in Western Tibet that have tried to, in their own way, begin the process of disentangling things like Bon indigenous religion, Shang Zhung, ethnicity, identity, archaeology, to try to begin to make sense of it, because the primary problem has been is that we've excavated too few sites and really don't have a way to put these sites as yet into time. So in other words, if you don't understand time and control that effectively, what happens is that you could be comparing apples and oranges so easily. And I think that a number of discussions we've had at the conference so far have been that kind of, look at this, doesn't this look like that? That means therefore these things are somehow necessarily related. Well, they may be or may not be, but the problem is that until you control for time via some kind of archaeological excavation, you really can't make those claims in an effective way. So the work I did out in West Tibet was with Sichuan University, based in Chengdu. I was working with a team of archaeologists from that program, Ho Wei and Li Yongshang, who were my colleagues at the time. And the goal of the research was twofold. One was the first project was to really look at Piyang Dungar and try to understand the evolution of Buddhist thinking in that region as part of the Chidar. I worked for them mapping the site and doing some other excavations for them as well, but I also excavated a site on my own called Din Dun, and Din Dun became very important because it's the earliest radiocarbon dated site in all of Western Tibet right now. That goes back to about 500 BC and goes down to about 100 AD or so. And the reason why that's important is because it has a number of aspects of both secular as well as religious activity and life at the site that provide us with a few insights into what might be called Shang Zhung. I try to avoid being very clearly definitive about terms like that because I know that I really am not certain whether or not these materials are Shang Zhung, but they do fall in a time frame that's thought to be Shang Zhung related. So I've tried to use those materials then from Din Dun, including their Do Ring. There's domestic architecture, there's mortuary sites of one kind or another. And what I've tried to do is to construct a very preliminary idea of what Shang Zhung ethnicity looks like from the ground up. We're not talking about elites here, we're talking about relatively common people. And so I've published some of that material in a variety of areas, and it's a start to begin to understand what's going on with what could in fact be Shang Zhung identity. The second major project was to go out to West Tibet and work on a place called Chunglung. And that, of course, is a rather contentious term in general. Chunglung was used by Tucci back in the 30s to describe what was called the Silver Castle. And I think that would be called the Chunglung, which one is it? The Chunglung Nulkar or Nulkar? Chunglung Nulkar. That's Tucci's Silver Castle. And near there, about 15 kilometers further up the Sutlej River, that is toward Kailash, is a place that I call Chunglung Mesa, which is also then called Chunglung Nulkar. And on top of this Chunglung Mesa, I use that term so as not to confuse myself with which one of these Chunglungs I'm talking about. What one finds on top of Chunglung Mesa is this extraordinary archaeological site. It has multiple levels, that is, it has a series of 3 major terraces upon it. It has a very clear defensive wall placed around it. It has evidence of domestic architecture, that is, of relatively simple people living their lives down below, animal corrals, water control and storage features. At the very tip top of it, it has some very clearly elite architecture. Not large. We're not looking at anything that's particularly substantial, but it's clearly different from the domestic architecture that sits down below. My interpretation of what Chunglung Mesa is that this is very likely to be a major settlement node in Western Tibet. Now, I'm very careful about what I mean by the idea of settlement node. Could this be the famous capital of the Shang Zhung polity? Quite likely it could be. Is it? I can't say that with certainty, but the scale of the site is remarkable. The complexity of the site is remarkable. And the radiocarbon dates that have been obtained from the site, at least the later series of dates, is fairly clear. It dates to about 700 AD or so, maybe a tiny bit earlier, around that era. And so that fits again with our understanding from textual sources about what Shang Zhung is supposed to be like. The site does show evidence of having been, at least some structures having been burned. Whether or not that was via conquest or some mistake of some kind on some bad accident, it's quite unclear. But what's important about the site is to be very, very certain that there's absolutely not a shred of what you would call Buddhist architecture upon that site. In other words, everything that's there fits within the model of Shangshung ethnicity that I was describing that I obtained from the Din Dun site, perhaps with some changes because it is later in time. But fundamentally, the site is not a Buddhist construction, so I feel very comfortable about that. Now, if you go down the valley then, past, leave Chunglung Mesa and then go down to the silver castle that Tucci discovered, it's fairly clear to me that I've been there now 3 or 4 times. I've walked the site. No excavations that I have done there because we had no permits to do so. But walking the site made it very clear that this is a Buddhist construction. That is, there's a typical range of Buddhist chortens, other sorts of ritual structures on the site. It is very clearly what the text says it is the development of a Buddhist tradition in this area that was identified in textual sources as the Silver Castle. It has all the right kind of attributes that should be described in a Buddhist text for this kind of place. There's one other place, though, on the landscape that I think is really important, and I'm hoping that permissions to travel, well, travel is no problem, but excavation and doing further research is somewhat difficult these days. There's a place that's immediately adjacent to Chunglung, the Silver Castle site. It's about 200, 300 meters further downstream, and it is this remarkable combination of a village site, which is very clearly a village site with very typical, what I called Shangshung ethnicity features. It has residential architecture of all different kinds. And it has a truly remarkable ritual complex atop a long spur that comes down from the hills into the valley floor below. And what's fascinating about this is this spur has do ring. It has miniature circles of one kind or another with small do ring penetrating from them. It has a whole variety of platforms, other sorts of evidence of burnings. It's truly unique. I have never seen anything like that in Western Tibet. And so I see that this is something that would be truly remarkable to go back and look at. It has what I'm calling a very large slab altar down below. It is something that could well, in fact, be the early, Shangshung era, pre-Shangshung era, silver castle that has been described, but not, of course, of Buddhist times. So the research that needs to be done out there is substantial. That is, to identify more of what Shangshung might look like, to further go into what the possibilities for Chunglung Mesa are in terms of really helping to identify that as a likely capital of the Shangshung polity, and then to look at those antecedents that I was describing from the site, slightly down river from the Silver Castle itself. That would be my desire, is to go back and work those sites, because there's some absolutely tremendous archaeology out there that's just waiting to be excavated. What I would like to do if I could get permission to go back there, and of course those permissions these days are somewhat more difficult. The Tibetan Bureau of Cultural Relics is a conservative organization, and they have not issued permits to many people in the recent past, so that one can go out as a tourist and look at these sites, but that of course means that you can't do anything with them. You can't excavate, you can't take materials away. What I would do if I had permission to go out there, the first thing I would do would be to spend a little time at this, what I'm thinking is this pre-Chunglung Nilkar, the early Silver Castle, because I think it needs to be placed in time. That is, it has all the right elements to be related to the Shangshung complex, except that we really just don't know how it fits into time. So going out there, excavating some of those smaller circles that we have out there, trying to clean off the architecture and really define the shape and form of the platforms that sit atop this mesa, and then look around the altar complex itself to try to get a sense of what might have taken place around that, as well as to just make sure that we understand the spatial extent of the village that surrounds, the area. That'd be the first thing I would do. The second thing I would do then is go back to Chunglung Mesa, as I've been calling it, and spend a little bit more time in the elite architecture that's all the way at the top of the structure. The excavations that were done back in 2004 were really relatively limited and spent their time down in the domestic or the kind of secular areas. I'd like to go up to the top and really get a better sense of what some of the elite architecture looks like, as well as find objects that may well be indicative of, ritual practice, other sorts of materials that may give us a different kind of clue about what Shangshung is like at this place. So that would be the ideal thing to do.
Thank you very much.
You're quite welcome. Thank you. So, those are things that, money would not necessarily be a problem for their studies. There are grants that could be done or other sorts of resources. It's just